It's no secret that I play a lot of fighting games, and that I've done so for quite some time at this point. Since I first entered into contact with the fighting game scene, a lot has changed. Lots of stuff for the better, and some debatably for the worse. You could probably chalk up a fair number of those things that I feel uncertain about to me just getting older. New thing scary, old thing comfy, yada yada yada, I know. Still, I'm noticing a trend in the scene that is seemingly only gaining more traction, and is one I heavily question the validity and value of. So if you would humor me for a bit, I'd like to talk to you about maximizing efficiency. A trait that might seem inherent to any competitive endeavor, but there are obviously certain qualities a community wants to promote efficiency in, and others which it finds less attractive for its player base to adopt wholesale. So without further ado, let's talk about leverless sticks, low latency setups, and modern control options. But before we get into any of my personal musings, perhaps a little intro to what we're actually going to be looking at, starting with controllers. If you're anything like me, the word fighting game immediately conjures up images of joystick-adorned arcade controllers in all the shapes, sizes, and hues of the world. And this with very good reason. Fighting games have their history firmly rooted, nay, cemented in the arcades. It's the place where they were first introduced to the world, where they rose to prominence, and where this community of ours sprouted from. The idea that fighting games as a genre are intrinsically tied to a joystick and a couple of buttons is factually undeniable. From the true arrival of the genre in '91 with Capcom's smash hit Street Fighter II, all the way to 2016 with the release of Street Fighter V, saw basically all majorly influential games in the genre still being designed specifically with an arcade cabinet in mind as the primary method of control. And even for series that had previously abandoned the arcades for home releases, like Soul Calibur and Marvel vs. Capcom, the games were undoubtedly still developed with a joystick in mind. To say that the fighting game community has historically been totally homogeneous in choice of controller would, however, be a lie. As consoles became the leading way to play the games, both at home and in tournament play, the scene saw more and more pad players join in. You would think that the addition of gamepads to the metagame of the FGC would have caused some major shakeups. And while there were certainly instances of this occurring, for example, Marvel player Fnatic utilizing a button bind allowing him to access one button dash in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, something not possible on the arcade version, largely gamepads were still more often than not just seen as suboptimal ways to interface with the games. In some series like Tekken, the switch to home consoles did see some direct changes to the way people control them though, with multi-binding several inputs to one button quickly becoming the norm for lots of players, both on gamepad and on stick. This seeing as the games recurrently presented the player base with very unforgiving simultaneous input windows. You could definitely muse over what made the community at large not ever realistically consider a ban on gamepads. One instantly noticeable fact is that it is hard to ban the peripheral that the console comes with without also drastically reducing your potential player base. But honestly, I think the major factor in gamepads being allowed without much fuss was that their potential gains over stick came bundled with what many saw as equally big drawbacks. And so it went on for a while, with arcades slowly being phased out as the primary way to play. Big tournaments like Evolution switching over from purely arcade hardware to console versions of the same titles in 2004, marking the almost complete turnover. Some large tournaments certainly held on for longer, Notably, the yearly Japanese fighting game event Togeki Super Battle Opera lasted all the way into 2012. And while gamepads were well entrenched, especially in the West, joystick was still the dominant way of play within the community. In 2010, however, a new contender was about to enter the ring. Brothers Sean and Dustin Huffer had the brilliant idea to get rid of the joystick entirely and instead replace it with, you guessed it, 2 joysticks. Just kidding. It was more buttons, actually, allowing you to control each directional input with an individual button instead of the stick of an arcade controller or the directional pad of a console-specific gamepad. Something that was technically already possible with a keyboard, but the brothers' new invention, dubbed the hitbox, not only made it more efficient with larger buttons placed more ergonomically, but also switching the position of the up input from a traditional keyboard layout to below the rest of the buttons, giving users an easy way to rest a finger on every individual direction. This, coupled with the fact that the hitbox was utilizing the PCBs of game console-specific gamepads, allowed it ease of access to the, at the time, absolutely console-dominated fighting game tournament scene. All 3 factors that made it leaps and bounds more attractive than something like a computer keyboard. The hitbox didn't actually make that much of a splash when it entered the scene. There was certainly an amount of hubbub going around about the controller close to its inception, but this quite quickly died down. The controller certainly didn't disappear, and there were strong players with strong placements utilizing a hitbox, but it did sort of fade away for a while from the FGC's public discourse. A few years later though, around the mid to late 2010s, adoption rates skyrocketed. Probably partly due to the large influx of PC players coming into the community through online play, a larger variety of manufacturers for hitbox-style peripherals, now dubbed leverless controllers, and of course a large number of high-profile professional players switching over to a leverless controller from an arcade stick. And why were these players making the jump to a new peripheral after years, sometimes decades, of using an arcade stick? The simple answer is that they thought it was more efficient. Broadly, the upsides of leverless controllers can be divvied up into 2 categories. The first and probably most immediately noticeable one has to do with travel time. Because leverless controllers offer discrete access to all directional movements by way of separate buttons, they unlock the ability for the user to teleport inputs. Something I'm sure sounds like a weird science fiction trope, so to paint a clearer picture, imagine for a second a joystick or a directional pad. Okay? Good. Now, imagine we are using said input methods to control a character in a 2D fighting game. Let's say we are trying to inch our way forward and still guard the incoming projectile our opponent is assailing us with. In order for us to switch inputs from walking to guarding, both control options have to spend time traveling from forward through neutral into back. The period of time between distinct inputs is what is collectively called travel time. A key distinction then between leverless controllers compared to its contemporaries is that it can largely reduce or arguably even entirely delete travel time between inputs. Consider switching from forward to back on a controller that allows a finger to rest in a ready state above both these inputs. Instead of traveling from forward through neutral and then to back, the game allows a player to directly teleport from forward to back without passing neutral. Tests run by a number of Japanese top players saw them cut their vulnerable period when walking forward into blocking in half, going from an average of 3 frames to 1.5. And while both these numbers are, in the grand scheme of things, very small windows of time, if you stop to consider just how much time on average is spent switching from walking to guarding, or simply switching guard directions from, say, low to high, it quickly becomes apparent how much of a gain slashing that time in half becomes. And guarding quicker is certainly not the only possible gain from teleporting inputs. But before that, this video is sponsored by nobody, actually, or maybe me. I do technically lose money on each of these projects, so if you like these enough to try and help me mitigate that, oh boy, do I have the news for you. The Rubbish Patreon is open and you can join the prestigious ranks of people giving me money to stave off my inevitable bankruptcy. So if you have an interest in that, please feel free to check it out. Links in the description. Most modern fighting games, 2D games especially, have heavily reduced the amount of inputs necessary to execute a slew of the special motions present in the game's roster. This to make specific motions more lenient and therefore more accessible. Leverless controllers can take advantage of this fact by way of teleporting inputs. Take for example the modern version of the 360 grappler input. Nominally, the 360 input is supposed to be, 360, a full circle. But seeing as it isn't the easiest thing in the world to hit every single input in a circle when under pressure, the input can actually be executed even if you skip up to a half of it. So you could, for example, on a stick, roll a half circle back into up back and get a spinning pile driver. And even if you missed, say, down forward, you would still be fine. However, on a leverless controller that allows you to teleport the inputs and also specifically hit exact coordinates every single time, you can consistently execute a 360 with only 4 inputs. Forward, down, back, up. Giving a player a way to consistently shorten travel time and cut inputs out of their gameplay is, if you can believe it, quite strong, and also a key driver in why a large number of top fighting game players have opted out of utilizing arcade sticks in favor of a leverless option. But if you recall, I stated earlier that teleporting inputs was just one of the controller's 2 upsides. Enter SOCD, or simultaneous opposite cardinal directions. It becomes instantly apparent if you sit down with a leverless controller that it can do something that is literally impossible on any other input method. That is, to hold forward and back at the same time. Since fighting games weren't developed with leverless controllers in mind, back when the hitbox launched, some games actually allowed holding both directions simultaneously. As you can imagine, something that led to some perhaps unintended interactions. In an effort to have their newfangled controller not be instantly nuked from orbit, the creators invented a so-called SOCD cleaner. A little electronics chip that intercepted any SOCD inputs and magically deleted them by turning 2 into 1. Problem solved, right? Right, guys? In reality, SOCD cleaning in all its forms, there exists a couple of variations, introduces as many wonky input variables as it gets rid of. The 2 variants of cleaning are neutral, which, as the name implies, turns any simultaneous press of forward and back or up and down into nothing. That is to say, a neutral input. While the other, last input wins, with its similarly straightforward naming scheme, instantly deleting the second to last cardinal input to instead opt for the latest one pressed. Last input wins. Get it? Yeah. A version of Last Input Wins has recently been banned by Capcom from its tournament series Capcom Pro Tour, meaning it will probably quickly fall out of favor in a lot of other communities. This version of input cleaning, perhaps most notably, allows for lightning-fast execution of charge moves. taking full advantage of the speed granted to it by teleporting inputs, while also completely ridding itself of having to let go of any held charge direction. This combination of traits allows leverless controllers with last input wins SOCD cleaning to more or less function as a strictly better option than other controllers for playing charge characters in 2D fighting games. Charge moves, for those uninitiated, being a subcategory of special moves that require the person piloting the character to hold a direction, most often back or down, for a set number of frames and then releasing it with forward or up. Last input wins then not only allows, as earlier stated, the fastest possible activation, but also gives the player an instant return to charging their attacks again after said activation has occurred with the press and release of a single button. As earlier stated, this version of cleaning has recently been banned from some tournament series. So what does the other version of cleaning look like? And does it also allow for, any funky input fuckery? Yes. Yes, it does. It turns out that being able to mimic a neutral input being made, combined with the ability to tap inputs, allows for some quite bizarre and incredibly strong fighting game antics. To highlight one specific use case, let's move away from the premiere 2D series of Street Fighter to the equally premiere 3D series of Tekken. The Korean backdash cancel, or KBD, is a movement technique so integral to the metagame of the Tekken series that it could rightfully be described as a core game mechanic. In short, Tekken's metagame relies heavily on creating whiffs through movement, and Korean backdash cancel is a technique that allows you to both increase your speed of backwards movement dramatically, while also keeping it very low risk. These strong properties stem from a combination of Tekken allowing blocking during backdash as long as the back direction is held, and the ability for all movement options, including backdash, to be instantly cancelled into each other. Korean backdash is, in a nutshell, just a backdash cancelled into a crouch, after which you again initiate another backdash. If we once again turn our heads over to our imaginary set of joystick and take a look at the set of motions required to execute the KBD, we get something that looks a bit like this. If done completely flawlessly, the KBD input starts with going from neutral to back to neutral again, into a second back input, sliding down to down back, then up to back again, and then lastly to neutral, and finally finishing with one last back input. This sequence of inputs translates to two backdashes done sequentially, one cancelled into the other. Further backdashes can be added by repeating the back, down back, back, neutral series of inputs. Now, as earlier stated, Tekken allows a character to guard any high or mid attack during a backdash as long as the player is holding the guard input, namely back, meaning for our series of KBD inputs, say done with the joystick, any frames spent not in back, that is, all inputs registered as down, neutral, and any travel time in between, leaves us vulnerable to attack. Furthermore, because we're all human, there is a definite risk of inputs being added to the sequence. An oft-occurring example would be an accidental down input being added before the down back, something that tends to be especially recurring for gamepad using players. In the grand scheme of things, the window of vulnerability added by a 1 or 2 frames of an extra input will most often not end up mattering in any one specific interaction, but it is common enough to note. For a neutral cleaning leverless controller, however, the sequence of inputs necessary to execute a KBD looks different. And when I say different, I mean weird. To complete our 2 backdash sequence on leverless, we hold back, tap down, tap forward, tap down, tap forward. That's it. By keeping the back input held on our controller, we can trick the game into giving us quote-unquote fresh back inputs in between our taps. Our held back plus down becomes our down back, and when our tap of down is released, our held back input becomes another back. The neutral cleaning of our SOCDs in turn make our taps of forward at first into a neutral input, and then when it's released, our still held back input becomes the last necessary back for our KBD. The upsides of this series of inputs should be somewhat obvious at first sight. Not only are we reducing a set of somewhat complicated movements down to a repeated tapping of two buttons which in turn come with a more or less non-existent risk of misinputs, our finger is also firmly planted on back for the entirety of the motion, meaning that not only do we have a very easy and basically instant travel time due to the earlier described teleporting inputs, the second we release our taps, we are already back to holding guard instantaneously. Meaning that just as with the vulnerable window for walking forward into guard, your window of vulnerability during KBD on a neutral cleaning leverless controller is consistently incredibly short. And when I say incredibly short, I mean that if it is done perfectly, the amount of vulnerable time is as low as 2 frames. Now, we're all human, and you will certainly not be hitting consistent consecutive frame-perfect KBD inputs on your leverless controller all the time. But just as with walking back and forth in 2D games, a match of Tekken sees both players spend, let's say, a noticeable amount of time executing Korean backdash, meaning consistently minimizing your vulnerable windows along with cutting down on the amount of inputs necessary adds up to be a very worthwhile investment. It is not a rarity to spot strong Tekken players executing 70+ backdashes in a match of Tekken 7, meaning if we generously just half our time spent vulnerable, we end up with several full seconds of vulnerability eliminated from our game time per match from our backdash alone. These examples only represent a fraction of an iceberg of tricks and workarounds that a bunch of very savvy and industrious players have found for leverless controllers. There's 1-button walking dragon punches, 4-frame super attacks, double tap instant supers, foreground step from crouch, and way more. And these are, I think, a key factor to the growth of the user base of leverless controllers. If an option both offers a strictly faster way to make inputs in combination with tricks that trivialize certain motions, why wouldn't you opt to use it? Even more recently, another wave of optimizing your gameplay has struck the FGC. But this one isn't tied to what sort of controller you're using. Or, well, it sort of, maybe it is. Yeah, I don't know. A little bit. Headlined by longtime NYC tournament organizer Arturo Sanchez, a movement to increase the responsiveness of the gaming setups we used to play on has started to take root, where strong PCs are being set up in a way to allow the minimization of input lag on the OS level, coupled with monitors and controller circuit boards with extremely high polling rates, all to purportedly give the player a way more responsive experience. On the complete other end of the spectrum, we have the developers themselves baking in new control options in their titles that, while ostensibly being marketed as tools for easing beginners' entry into the games, are instead being utilized by top competitive players as a way to optimize their gameplay. Most recently and easily most notable is the modern control option in Capcom Street Fighter VI. Street Fighter VI offers you 2 ways to control any given character within the game: Classic and Modern. Classic, just as the name implies, in this case acting as the historically traditional way in which Street Fighter handles its inputs. The 6 available face buttons all correspond to a specific type of normal attack, and special moves being executed with a combination of directional inputs. On modern controls, however, you, on the face of it, lose access to a couple of your possible attack options, but your special and super moves are instead mapped onto single button presses, granting users of the control scheme access to instantly activating super and special moves. A sort of juiced up version of a macro. In the example of using a double quarter circle forward reaction super attack to an opponent's move, not only is the input necessary to activate the super reduced to a single press, the game definitionally ends up giving you a strictly faster version of the super move. This because the engine of the game isn't mechanically inputting the double quarter circle in the fastest way possible, it is instead just skipping it entirely. Modern controls don't come without a cost though, with modern attacks being penalized by a 20% damage reduction, and also not offering access to every version of a character's special moves. These are both costs that can be circumvented, however, since modern controlled characters can still input both their special and super attacks in the classic fashion. Meaning that while you will, on a technical level, be losing out on some attacks, the reality of the situation is that many characters will still have access to the vast majority of their important tools and can still dish out normally damaging combos where the added benefit of faster inputs isn't very important. Something that leads some players to question the validity of sticking to classic controls when modern will offer them strictly better versions of some very, very strong options. From an outside perspective, it might seem like I'm wibbly-wobbling my way through a bunch of only tangentially related topics. But in my opinion, the argument for this continued hunt for more and more input-optimized, lag-reduced and responsive ways to interact with the game having any intrinsic value for the community at large, and not solely for the individual, is and will always be almost entirely self-defeating. In my opinion, any argument for the good of increasing the efficiency, say being able to more easily execute techniques that are very mechanically straining or inconsistent, or responsiveness, say being able to react to more actions in the game more easily, will fall into two categories, both of which are inherently flawed. Argument 1 sounds something like this. We ought to push the envelope to create a consistent lag-reduced competitive standard that allows tournament participants to play on an even playing field. A pursuit that, while it definitely sounds noble, seems to miss the mark by like a mile by focusing on the highest end of efficiency possible. A search for this most optimized and responsive way to play is always going to end up being less inclusive than finding cheap and good enough alternatives. If the aim is for as many players as possible to have access to a setup of tournament standard, then aiming for the average is the most even-handed approach. Now, there is of course an argument for community-dictated tournament standards being put in place for titles with extremely high latency. But that is not necessarily the argument being made, and I think you would struggle to currently find a modern fighting game title that is inherently crippled when it comes to input lag. But what if we want to be more efficient for efficiency's sake? Well, the second argument goes as follows. We ought to push the envelope as much as possible when it comes to what can be practically executed within the games. Faster is innately better. This second argument is to me self-defeating at the very first glance. The value of what specific reaction speed is and is not considered too slow or too fast is entirely arbitrary. And the same goes for what is and is not considered too hard to execute in terms of technique. The gating for what we deem to be suitable amounts of difficulty is entirely decided on what input method we choose to communicate with the game, and how much lag said method and game generates on our inputs. Some techniques and reaction checks will always be too hard and therefore be out of reach. Making the currently gated interactions easier just moves the goalpost and creates a new set of interactions that are similarly, once more, just out of reach. It is also, I think, quite easy to argue that faster reactions and easier execution aren't innately good. I don't think most of us would enjoy playing a game where all mix-ups could be guarded on reaction and there existed zero mechanically difficult sequences. Something that means there is obviously a line somewhere where we consider it too much. This very argument is one that is currently being used against the tournament legality of modern controls in Street Fighter VI, a prevailing opinion seemingly being that the omnipresent lightning-quick reaction supers you are given access to with certain characters impact the metagame of Street Fighter VI in a negative way for both players and spectators. This is less often brought up as an argument against the tournament legality of efficiency-boosting out-of-game options like leverless controllers and super fast lag-reduced peripherals. This, even though modern controls are technically more egalitarian, seeing as they incur no extra monetary cost on the potential user. Something that to me leads the proponent of efficiency only down one logical road. One that is quite seldom spoken out loud. If you ask someone what it is they like about modern controls or their snack box micro leverless controller, they can answer either A, I like that it allows me to execute things I couldn't before, in which case the value of this gain can only be measured in it being harder on a different peripheral or control scheme, meaning it has absolutely zero value in a world in which these are the standard methods of control. Or B, I like that it makes me selectively win more than I used to because it is a literal boost in efficiency. In which case, I think most of us agree that this is a bad thing. Or at least, I hope most of us would. More nebulously, but equally important, I think, is to take a zoomed-out look at what we want fighting games to be. In my eyes, this hunt for increased efficiency in, for lack of better wording, out-of-game peripherals misses a big point of what we all find so enticing in the hobby. Spectacle is intrinsically tied to scarcity. We all get hyped over someone hitting a difficult combo or timing a crazy whiff punish because we all, in our core, understand that we are witnessing something difficult, something rare. Searching for ways to make these things easier and thus more commonplace is kinda missing the entire point, don't you think? And sure, as touched upon earlier, there will be a moment in time where being able to easily land a hard thing will still feel like a spectacle. But that moment is doomed to never last. And once something has become commonplace, it sure as hell tends to stay that way. An argument often tossed around in the defense of leverless controllers is that all these things are technically possible already, either with frame-perfect inputs or because a player utilizing a gamepad could theoretically employ both the directional pad and an analog stick simultaneously, allowing them access to SOCDs, something that the leverless controller derives its legality from. Now, I understand that it is, of course, extremely vague to accurately pinpoint what is and isn't difficult. Different people will find different peripherals more or less intuitive to work with, and strong competitors will grind out difficult techniques to their heart's content regardless. But I still think you need to consider the spirit of the thing. In hockey, you are allowed to carry the puck on your hockey stick as long as you keep it underneath the height of your shoulders. If you were to use a lacrosse stick instead, you could certainly execute this technique more efficiently. You wouldn't technically be doing something not possible with a hockey stick, But I think most of us would agree it wouldn't really be hockey anymore, right? Leverless controllers attaining their legality through what some might consider an oversight in a game's coding comes across as somewhat lackadaisical to me. A ruling that leads to control options like hitbox cross-up to be illegal. A peripheral that houses both a joystick and an extra set of buttons that also correspond to the directional inputs. Meaning it is a control option that simultaneously offers all the functionality of a leverless controller and all the functionality of a joystick. There have been rulings that seem to suggest a ban of the use of such controllers, but they certainly aren't being enforced, nor is the company producing the cross-up reading said ruling as such. If you were so inclined, you could probably produce arguments that would present the classic joystick as being more efficient than a leverless controller in some departments. I would probably question the validity of those claims, but I definitely believe that someone could, and probably have already made them. It is, however, quite a lot harder to make the argument that the cross-up isn't a strictly better version of an arcade joystick. It literally has the exact same functionality, plus more. Now, if the community, or a developer of a fighting game title, were to theoretically ban the use of more than one directional input method, either by way of a new tournament ruling, or simply by not having the game allow more than one option per control scheme, would that not then necessitate an immediate ban on leverless controllers on the grounds that they can now execute something no longer possible on other peripherals? It seems to me a clumsy way to argue for their status as valid peripherals. Often enough, you'll have people express how dumb it is to say,
"Personally, my view on competitive fighting game tournaments is everyone should use arcade sticks."
And while it certainly is a statement with some pretty glaring holes in it, it does still offer some food for thought. If you consider a variety of competitive endeavors, sports, hobbies, and competitions, etc., I think you will quickly come to the conclusion that most of them are rarely something we interact with through the medium that is the most efficient. You could drill out the center of your baseball bat and cork it to make it lighter to swing. You could run instead of power walk to faster reach the finish line. You could put a trajectory assisting laser dot sight on your darts. You could wear spring-loaded shoes to a dunking contest. You could. More recently, the FGC has seen some high-profile actors put forth the idea that we just ought not to meddle much in the area of legality ourselves. Instead, now that the leverless controllers have been on the scene for a while, we just go with what the game developers themselves code into their games. And there certainly is some grounds for that position. Unlike in past eras where the games themselves were completely incapable of handling SOCDs, giving you access to blocking in both directions and the like, modern games instead have built-in rulings for what happens when these sorts of inputs occur. The reasoning by these people is that with time, developers will be forced to more thoroughly account for the implications of the addition of leverless controllers. But I think this imagined future scenario falls equally flat as most other arguments. If developers quote-unquote account for leverless controllers to make them less efficient, then what was the fucking point of even having them in the first place? Furthermore, if said accounting in any way as a side effect changes the necessary execution requirements of a controller using a joystick, you're literally back to square one. Not to mention how inelegant such a solution is for the FGC moving forward in time, when such a big part of the culture revolves around the relative ease of jumping between titles and communities. A quarter circle forward is a quarter circle forward, regardless of if you're playing 1999 Street Fighter III Third Strike or 2022's DNF Duel. Lastly, there is an argument to be made for the continued legality of both in-game efficiency boosting like modern controls and out-of-game ones like leverless controllers. And it, in my opinion, rests pretty much entirely in the soothing hands of ergonomics. There are a number of people who, because of their hand concerns, cannot safely or effectively make use of either gamepad or joystick. And for these players, more ergonomically fabricated leverless controllers of different makes have given them a chance to still engage with the hobby and compete. And while I agree with this being a great thing, I'm not necessarily sure it makes for a great argument. To me, injury and the genetic lottery are an inevitable part of engaging in any competition. And as much as it sucks, if your injury doesn't allow you to compete anymore, then that is what it is. We don't allow a person with a leg injury to ride their bike in a marathon, even if that means they can no longer participate. To make the case for ergonomics, I think you would have to show proof that joysticks are unavoidably going to cause injury, and not that some people who are injured cannot use it. I of course think ergonomic controllers are a great thing, and letting people regain access to playing is beautiful. But some minuscule amount of people facing hand strains doesn't mean everyone else ought to be impacted. Now, do I think we will ever see a ruling that disallows leverless controllers? Do I think we will see people stop chasing out of game advantages? Fuck no. No way that this will ever happen. Not only are we so culturally far removed from that notion, I have a hard time finding any analogy that neatly puts it into some sort of perspective, but even if we were there, the ruling for leverless controllers would reasonably had to have been made about a decade ago. The problem with not having this discussion back then and adopting a wait-and-see attitude is that even if people were to endorse a ruling, we would practically be setting so many players back, both financially and time investment-wise. No, these controllers are here to stay, which means joysticks are, on the flip side, probably not long for this world. Something I think sucks. I think it sucks for many reasons. For one, I think joysticks are beautiful. The sounds they produce hit me like comfort food, and they feel so goddamn good to use. And that possibly being lost to time sucks. It sucks to me that I can no longer instantly have this physical connection with people, even when we are ostensibly supposed to be having the same experience. It sucks that I cannot know if the person I'm playing online has slick as fuck movement, or if they are just tapping two buttons. If the person I just played had insane reactions, or if they were just tapping two buttons. If this person just did like 3 just frame inputs to sidewalk from crouch, or if they were just tapping 2 buttons. That's not to disparage anyone who uses a controller like that. I suppose you gotta do what you gotta do. Anyway, check out this sick fucking standing 720.